Why are so many people in France furious right now? We've seen fires in the streets, violent clashes between protesters and police, and millions of people across the country taking part in a seemingly endless stream of strikes and protests.
The democracy is dead today.
The reason behind these protests is a decision by French President Emmanuel Macron to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64. Now, seeing this level of anger over a decision about retirement age may seem confusing to people outside of France, especially considering that France had one of the lowest retirement ages for an OECD nation, and even at 64, it's still in the bottom half. The thing is, there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye, but before we get into all of that, let's quickly cover why President Macron has been so set on pushing through this controversial change. In simple terms, it has to do with rising debt and an ageing population. People in France have been living longer, and birth rates have been dropping. And when you combine these two things, you can end up with an ageing population.
Au moment où moi je suis rentré dans la vie active, il y avait 10 millions de retraités. Il y en a aujourd'hui 17 millions. Dans les années 2030, il y en aura 20 millions.
When a bigger percentage of your population is retired, more of your country's spending inevitably goes towards pensions, and also to things like healthcare. Not only that, but it can also mean having fewer people in the workforce, and that has its own set of knock-on effects too. One of which is often less tax money going to the government. France is already far and away one of the highest proportionate spenders on pensions in the OECD, and it also has one of the biggest debts in proportion to GDP in the EU. You can probably see where this is going. By raising the retirement age, you not only keep people in the workforce for longer, but it also means that you have fewer pensions to pay for. It's a change that a number of countries have already made in recent years. So, why exactly are so many people in France so angry about all of this? It's not just that people are angry about what the change is, there's also anger at who made the change and how he did it. But let's start with the what, because there's a bit to unpack here. The first thing is that generous retirement benefits and early retirement are seen as a unique and proud part of French culture and identity.
France has a system of social security that rightly people are very proud of. The guarantees here make some other countries enviable, and people are naturally very protective of that.
There's also the pretty basic fact that most people aren't really keen on the idea of having to work longer. Some protesters say they're also worried about age discrimination, arguing that it's already tough for a lot of people in their 60s to find and keep work.
No, it's not true that you can work until you're 64 years old. Not because you don't want to, but because companies are laying off seniors.
And then there are those who say that this is an attack on blue-collar workers, because working an extra 2 years in an office job is a lot different to working an extra 2 years in a physically demanding job. This last point in particular ties into a narrative that's often pushed by opponents of President Macron, that the president, a former investment banker, is an elitist and a friend of the rich. A number of the protesters have been arguing that the president should be raising taxes on the ultra-wealthy instead of raising the retirement age.
They're looking for solutions to finance the pension system. There's a very simple solution. It's to take from the pockets of billionaires.
President Macron, of course, denies that he's an elitist. But one thing that's hard to deny is that the president just isn't very popular in France right now, and hasn't been for a while. So, for some, these protests aren't just about venting their frustrations with the retirement changes, but also venting their frustrations about the president himself.
The issue in France right now is broader than just the reform on pension. It's people being angry about the very neoliberal political agenda that Macron has been pursuing.
All of this brings us to the final point, and for many, the biggest reason why they're so angry with the president. After the 2022 election, the president's centrist coalition lost its majority in France's National Assembly. So, fearing that this deeply unpopular change wouldn't get enough votes to pass through France's parliament, the president decided to use a special constitutional power to bypass a democratic vote in the lower house. This is why you're hearing a lot of people at the protests talking about the death of democracy. Now, one justification for this is that President Macron very openly talked about planning to do this while campaigning to be president in 2022. And so that's what the public voted for when they elected him to a second term. However, it's safe to say that a lot of people in France aren't really satisfied with that reasoning.
What can I say? I'm shocked. We're living in a democracy, and it's not a democracy.
We want to be listened, and it's all about that, not just the pensions.
President Macron says that he knows this is an unpopular move, but maintains that it's a necessary one. He's also offered to meet with union leaders to try to sort out some of their concerns around things like wages and employment protections for older workers. But despite all of that, it doesn't look like protesting will be stopping anytime soon. Unions have called for a further day of massive protests on May 1st, and have said that they won't be speaking to the president, at least until then.